and sometimes at the exclusion of the people that the issues are about. Um,
Give us an example of that.
so we'll take homelessness, for example. In the town I was writing in at the time, um, called Brattleboro, Vermont. One of the main reasons that I guess, started writing about the issues and interviewing about the issues was that I noticed that in the local newspapers, there were lots of articles related to um, the homeless issue in town, in various different ways. Some would be about, should we move this shelter, and if we move it, where are we going to move it? Debates about the location. What are we going to do about the panhandling problem? People standing on the street asking for money. Um, and you would see, here's what the people who live in the neighborhood where the shelter might go think about this. Here's what the agency that runs the shelter thinks about this. Here's what various social workers think about this in the community. Here's what, let's say the church thinks about it at the community, in some cases because they were sheltering people, because this agency didn't have its own shelter space for a period. And when it comes to panhandling, it would be like, here's what the business owners think about panhandling. Here's what the police think about it. Here's what people who showed up to town meeting think about it, or the local select board members think about it. But typically, panhandlers were not interviewed. The people who were going to be staying at those shelters were not interviewed. And so there was a very narrow scope of discussion, I thought, in the local public discourse as a result of that. And also, I would say, and I have a tendency to go on too long, so interrupt me at any time. I would also point out that uh, I think the public discourse also suffered, it became slightly less sophisticated as a result. This is an area that is fairly progressive, liberal, at least largely thinks of itself that way, is pretty accepting of others, tolerant, I think people would use the word. But when it comes to homeless people, it's just not the case. I mean, you'd see, in one of the introductions to one of my books, I pointed out that there were lots of articles about, like I said earlier, like you'd have an article titled like the panhandling problem. And, you'd have business owners or whatever quoted about what they think about it. And I recommended in the book, like, to, go through some of those articles and just replace the word panhandler with like any other group of person. And I think that, like, most people in the community, I hope, would find it problematic.
Like you said, the Irish.
Yeah.
The Irish keep asking for money.
Yeah, there's all of a sudden there's an influx of Irish in town, and I don't like seeing them around. I'm scared of them. Uh, um, and they make me uncomfortable. They make it hard for me to operate my business. The just take any other group, the Mexicans or the Jews are making it hard for me to operate my business. I don't like them hanging.
We can't even joke about that because all the
outside my
anti-Semitism on the show that we usually have. So we can't even joke about Jews.
Sorry,
Very fine people, the Jews.
Yeah.
They don't. We're not even joking about you because you're so fine people. Please don't
Yeah.
don't cancel us. We saw what you guys did to Breonna Joy Gray.
But just imagine like newspaper articles in your local town newspaper saying that business owners in town are upset about the number of whatever group hanging around outside their storefronts or whatever.
Irish Jews. We can joke about Irish Jews.
I think I would hope that that would be unpalatable even to most of the people who are saying these things or reporting these things. And so, and it's similar, prisoners face different barriers um, to getting their stories out, but often still in local newspaper. And there are some reporters actually that do a really good job, even local reporters uh, who I know and do actually do a pretty great job of getting the prisoners' perspectives in their stories. I would say slightly more common than with homeless people, but still, prisoners face various barriers to getting their stories out, perhaps for obvious reasons.
I mean, do you think though that people do want to talk to homeless people and prisoners whenever it's a story about scandal, i.e., um, let's say there's a corrupt warden, everybody can't wait to talk to a prisoner, or maybe there's a guard scandal like we had at Corcoran Prison, and that's how you pronounce it, in the 90s, I think the late 80s, 90s, where they were actually doing like a fight club where they would get people from different rival gangs when the gangs were really a problem. Sorry, Kendrick Lamar. He didn't really do much. But get gangs when they were really a problem and like make them fight. And they were recording it. It was bad. And, of course you want to talk to prisoners then. If you want to talk to homeless people when, maybe you want to show that a nonprofit is mishandling funds, they can't wait to talk to homeless people then. Or for example, there's a gentleman that works with the unhoused and has for decades in San Francisco, and the Examiner ran an insane hit piece on him. And as you know, for someone that's worked inside permanent supportive housing, it's a challenge. Depending on if you're dealing with a brand new building or an older building, and San Francisco is an old city for our West Coast standards, an older city, and you're dealing with much older buildings. You also don't have a lot of help in maintaining the buildings, and you're also dealing with the most vulnerable of a population that gets inside said building. So people that haven't had shelter, people that have severe mental illness, and I think we have to be honest from the jump. There's only so much services that you're really giving people on an individual level, um, because there's so many issues that people have that have gone misdiagnosed. I think we were having a conversation about this the other day, and like autism is one of those things that if you're of a certain age, you weren't getting diagnosed with ADHD or autism. If you could function enough to have some basic skills, we'll throw you in a classroom literally to fail because we don't even know have like special education. And what happens to these people years later when a certain um aspect of society is gone, especially a deindustrialized America where you could be a high school dropout and still get a job and support a family, and all that's gone. So you are dealing with a segment of the population that gives no fucks sometimes about you know taking out the trash or fighting with your neighbor. It's a lot to deal with, and that I feel like is when reporters love shoving a mic in someone's face that probably shouldn't be speaking on
Mm.
behalf of a population. But I'm not disagreeing with anything you're saying.
Yeah, I think also it's important to distinguish between the kinds of reporting. I mean, there's certainly uh, like local TV or online news reporting that just kind of follows around cops and, you know, uh, while they have, personal, while the cops interact with people who are experiencing personal crises and stuff. And, but in terms of, I guess, more traditional mainstream reporting, I would say, I would say 2 things going back to what you were saying at the beginning, about when people are suddenly interested in talking to prisoners.
Mhm.
Very hard to predict. I mean, first of all, the kinds of scandals that you're talking about, there might be reporters who take an interest in them, but, um, particularly like the example you gave at a nonprofit agency, I mean, it's I think unlikely that the scandal is exposed. I don't know if you're thinking of a specific example, I'm not, but I think
Mm.
something being exposed like that in a nonprofit would less likely be exposed by a particular homeless person if a nonprofit mismanaged funds. And perhaps there would be a reporter interested in their perspective on that. But I would also say that particularly in the case of the prisons, there's just scandals ongoing all the time in their minds,
Yeah.
in the prisoners' minds, correctly, I think, with the wardens and every other aspect of the management of the prison systems. And it's extremely hard to predict when the state, when the media are going to take an interest in that. I mean, I'll just give you one example. Like, uh, I was writing my book on the prisons. I was writing a very different book on the prisons before the COVID outbreak took place. And like literally weeks passed before there were announcements in the Alabama newspapers, weeks after things like schools and other institutions shutting down, weeks passed before any announcements were even made. At one point, there was this horrifying story that was broken in, I think, either AL.com or Alabama Political Reporter about about somebody had leaked a DOC document memorandum or something about like what the plan would be if there were mass deaths in the prison system as a result of COVID. And this was before we knew, what populations, as much about what populations were most at risk and things like that. And it was pretty scary time. Like, we really thought like there could be, really unsustainable, to use that really unpalatable word in this situation, number of deaths in the prison system,
Mhm.
where the departments of corrections were talking about like the types of logistical problems that it would pose and how to solve them in some cases using prison labor. And um, Even in that initial story of that leak, if I remember correctly, it's years ago now. I'm happy to be wrong about this, but if I remember correctly, even that story, they did not interview a prisoner in that initial leaked in this initial story about that leak. Very
The
difficult to predict when a particular crisis or scandal is going to trigger. I was pretty shocked
Mhm.
that I was totally by myself working on this. I did not have any income. I was in the process of losing my apartment. I just did it because I had an interest in it, and I happened to have, you know, connections to people on the ground going through it who I could learn more about it
Sounds
from.
like you were on the ground going through it.
I really felt like I was doing it because nobody else was,
Yeah.
and my little, basically self-published book, I think was the first one about prisons in the pandemic in America.